right? Another one of these speaking practices. I don't know what to talk about. I think it's been a few days since I've done one of these. Just like demands and frustrations with work, with day-to-day duties have kind of taken over. Although I have had some, and in terms of this states theme or project, I haven't gotten as far with it as maybe I would like to, or as far as maybe I would have if I had more time. I'm actually doing pretty well with this like paper theme, though, which I'm almost wondering whether I should just keep going with the paper theme. Call it a day for states is the theme, given that I'm doing the paper one and I'm not doing the states one. Which is that I get that I'm, flipping through a coffee table book featuring the photography of Bill Cunningham, the New York street photographer. And I'm also just starting. I don't want to make any promises, but I'm just starting a book, which is all about the Moss family's movie theater chain in New York City. And it touches on the early, the early history of film exhibition in New York during the silent era. I may have already mentioned this actually in a speaking practice that I picked up this book. Anyways, I've read the first few pages of it. So far, so good, and it's written for the lay reader, for sure. Interestingly, after I bought it, I realized that it's actually authored. It has two authors. One of them is, the grandson of the original Moss patriarch. And the other author, who would be, sort of the professional author working with this non-professional writer. Non-professional theater exhibitor. That's the right word. Anyways, professional author working with them is Jonathan Kay, who is a former editor of The Walrus. More recently has been editing for Quillette. He's not terribly conservative, but he is a bit more kind of politically conservative than probably most people in the publishing world in Canada. And he is he's been involved with sort of Quillette and kind of intellectual dark web actually not so much that, but just sort of, I guess we call it heterodox, but maybe slightly more militant, anti-social justice, warrior, culture war figure. And definitely somebody with a sort of an axe to grind a few years ago. Sounds like he's interested in just being able to kind of move away from culture war topics, and he's always been a writer he's a professional writer. He's been writing about other things for some time. And I'm, of course I am sort of sympathetic to the political, or at least, a few years ago I was following him more closely, and I've used Twitter for some time, and I fundamentally kind of sympathetic, obviously, or more on his side than his opponent's side on sort of culture war topics. But for whatever reason, speaking right now to my imaginary audience, I feel reticent to kind of pick sides, even though it's obviously, if you looked at my heart, you would know that I was clearly on one side. Although I guess in terms of some of the anger or aggrievement or not giving the other side another inch, there's this thought I've had in my head lately, something that I've been meaning to articulate as a tweet, which is that, basically anybody kind of takes to the streets as an activist of any kind, or does something in protest. Like, they always have some kind of point. There's always some virtue that they are standing up for, a virtue that, when you look at the virtue itself, is pretty widely, probably universally recognized as like a good thing to stand up for. Problem is there's virtues. I feel like virtues are in competition with each other. Principles. We have virtue principles. yeah, where worthy principles um, are in competition all the time. And anyways, I feel like every activist is standing up for an important, like a worthy principle. Um, but activists, I feel, have like ultimately kind of the wrong policy when it comes to matters of, say, pub policy, or what you could call this sort of governing, whatever this sort of governing policy should be. I feel like almost every activist policy recommendation is wrong, particularly the policy recommendation that comes out of that activist energy. Because, yeah, it's sort of an emotional standing up for one side. Now, this is taking me more into this sort of internal, those are sort of, this is me just thinking very broadly about kind of external politics. But if I then return to the sort of internal politics of IFS in internal family systems, thinking of oneself as having you know, there's some kind of self, which is the sort of quiet, like I'd say almost sort of fundamental, almost sort of good natured. It's nice to believe a sort of like some good natured sort of whole part, this self, is being counseled all the time by different parts or agents. Like using the word agent. Parts, that's the IFS term, but I guess I don't know where I picked up the vocabulary of agents. Maybe it's something to do with the bicameral mind, or neuroscience, some aspect of neuroscience. But I've just been thinking of inside there's all of these agents that are often in competition with each other, and seeking airtime and wanting to maybe kind of steer the ship or exert their influence on the self. Anyways, this idea of thinking of oneself as just being sort of this collection of different like little personas inside, and thinking about sort of self-government as being the act or process. What's the verb? I don't know the verb of I guess just sort of how you manage or govern all those little parts. And I mean, this is all like a work of like self fiction or storytelling. Maybe it's even a sort of, you call it some kind of like storytelling technology. It does sound like, in terms of almost how the mind works, though, there is this, in terms of the world of, I guess, sort of how our consciousness works, there is this like building and emulating or growing of these imaginary voices, characters. And I can think about Steve, and it's like I have this little emulator of Steve that operates in my mind, emulating Steve's operating system within my own kind of operating system. And the little agent Steve, I'll call him, in my head is saying things to me and talking to me often. And when Steve is having a hard time being pleasant or polite or considerate or whatever, my little agent Steve takes those cues and will become much ruder, and I'll find myself on the inside being berated by what feels like berated or criticized. We'll say criticized or being told, oh, you're doing it wrong, by the little inner agent Steve. I'll hear agent Steve saying, I think, very ungenerous things to me, rude things to me, maybe 3 times for every time that Steve actually says something rude. Yeah, that was something I was thinking about yesterday. Just that language or articulation way of explaining, I guess, what I experience. Be interesting to know how universal that is. Just as lots of people studying consciousness have wondered about how universal the inner monologue is, and it seems like there's people out there that do not have a running inner monologue. That they're not that there isn't this vocal track like running inside their psyches all the time, and that's I find that very hard to imagine. But at the same time, I also don't know how you measure that. Like in terms of my ability to kind of my visual imagination, I don't know how I'd be able. My dad says that he doesn't have one. I think I have one, but I don't know how to. I'm like, but do I? Do I actually? Yeah. To what extent am I able to like render imagery in my mind in the same way that other people do, or maybe even the way that I used to. I can't remember if I already spoke to this in another video, but I do sometimes wonder like if I back when I was drawing and painting and creating images and looking at the world in a more kind of aesthetic way, making little judgments about what I liked the look of and didn't like the look of in a different way, and maybe being more excited by just the visual of certain things. Like, oh God, I don't know, part of this is just regretting how drawn to anime I was as a teenager. But I used to, I could be more enchanted by things, by visuals that I thought were great. And I wonder at that time if there was more, just some kind of inner ability to vision, inner vision of how to create an outer vision. All right, this is getting a bit murky. Where was I? But yeah, paper, reading books, writing down notes on paper. Obviously, I love Post-it notes, but I don't use them as much as I could. Use those to better advantage. But yeah, looking for opportunities to sometimes read something off of paper rather than off of my phone. This doesn't have anything to do with paper. Well, maybe it does. I'd like to go back to finishing some of the audiobooks I've started. The Imago therapy one, which is maybe just starting to get to a really interesting part, but it is a very long book. I'm more interested, I think, in IFS right now. And the audiobook I previously downloaded for IFS, it's actually more like a series of exercises where you listen to them and do them. But I guess maybe I should start with the book, where it's just more kind of a straight up book presentation of the theory. Maybe it is just called No Bad Parts. And maybe this could fit my paper theme if I say that the book was something that was conceived of as to be something read on paper. And so to listen to an audiobook of something that was sort of like paper publishing first fits the paper theme more than listening to some of the podcast or YouTube content that I like, that is more conversation and based, but also more digital, digital tech, internet first, let's say. Network. You can say it was sort of certain kind of like internet. I'm going to say network first. I like that. I also want to locate some of the other, so tempting to buy some new coffee table books, but I can also just dust off some of the more visual books that I have lying around, including that one, Marshall McLuhan book full of his probes. It's the wallpaper pattern book. I already have that World Receivers art book on my bookshelf, but I can maybe have that someplace where I could just sort of flip through it. Oh, that book of symbols. That encyclopedia of symbols. It's a Taschen book. It's so impressive. And I know when I saw it, discovered, I thought this book is amazing. Like, what a feat of, it was these collections of almost encyclopedia style essays about the historical, about like the historical and cultural significance of different symbols, whether it's a symbol of a tree or the symbol of a bear, natural and human worlds. And I've been thinking about that book in a light of the advent of this DALL-E, artificial general intelligence software or program where you give it some verbal direction and then it will create an image based on your verbal direction. And it makes me think about basically it's almost like being able to cast a spell to get a picture. It's like magic. And the people that will be able to perhaps create some of the most thrilling images are people who have command of language, but particularly a good sense of I guess with words. There are multiple associations, because you could call this sort of like the word rotators, for the people who already have a sense of maybe of when you take a word, what it's meant, different sort of facets or aspects can be, and having a good sense of perhaps more kind of symbolically or generally how a visual object like lands on the eyes and minds of other people. And it seems to like there's all kinds of potential for doing kind of interesting symbolic art. I mean, I guess the image that gets rendered by the AGI, it's using millions of images that have already been created by people to create its own art. The word omnivorous comes to mind, but that's not even right. It's leveraging what has already been created by people to create its own thing. So who knows? Maybe actually DALL-E is the thing that can uncover that. Maybe the word wizard actually, maybe they don't need to be aware of all the No, I think they should. I think they should be, but I'm saying that, but at the same time, DALL-E is also bringing that to the table. Okay, I hear June waking up, so I am going to log off. Yeah, I didn't know what I was going to say here. I've gone over some things that have just been on my mind the last few days without it necessarily becoming a total therapy session, which is not really, I mean, I can see these things going in that direction, but that right now is not necessarily what I want to do with this. This is speaking practice, not video therapy, but inevitably it is video therapy. All right, take care.